Okay, good morning, Dad.
Good morning.
Today is Wednesday, March 5th, and what's on your mind?
Um, Trump's speech. Yeah,
Trump's
I watched
speech.
it. I didn't watch all of it. I watched a good part of it until I just found myself nodding off. Not exactly nodding off, but I began to lose interest. Um, I saw maybe the first 30, 40 minutes of it. And he didn't get to any of the main topics that we discuss normally, but later I read summaries of what he had to say about Ukraine, for example. But it just gave me a reminder of the kind of person that Trump is, and his boastful nature. You can say narcissistic, um, but yeah, which I think is actually a problem because a lot of the times he becomes concerned more about how much. Uh, about the show. He is a showman, about the show more than the reality. And I think that's a danger that we have to take it into account when we're looking at, for example, the developments, the very promising, hopeful developments in Ukraine. Um, I think you see with Trump, being a showman, there's always a tendency to sort of like to do something for the sake of show, like the minerals deal, rather than for the substance, to claim something, some great achievement. Yeah, he did start the speech. He went on for several minutes, went on for quite a while about how his administration was just the most administration that had ever existed.
I mean,
He
the
was basically,
greatest.
yeah, what did I just
You
say?
said his administration was the
Oh,
administration
okay,
of
yeah,
the.
very
Okay,
good.
so.
Thank you very much. Okay. Yes, please correct me when I do things like that. Yeah, the greatest administration that had ever existed, certainly in U.S. history and probably, on the face of the earth. And yeah, that he had accomplished more in 4 weeks than most administrations accomplish in 8 years. And that might be true in some cases, actually, because there certainly was some do nothing administrations, and he's doing a lot. We have to say, it's not quite clear how this is all going to end up, but lots of executive orders and that kind of thing. There's been a flurry of activity. Um, but he didn't just stick to the facts. He embellished. He described this as the beginning of a golden age of America. Trump, the greatest president of all time, was ushering in the golden age of America. And I hope that's true, but I have my doubts about that. Another thing that I was struck about was the very sharp division between the two parties. You have the Democrats are seated on one side, to the president's right, and the Republicans on the other, to his left. The Republicans were constantly clapping and often standing and giving him standing ovations, and but then the Democrats, in contrast, just sat there glumly, silently. There were actually a couple of protests. I think there was a Congressman Green that started shouting something. I couldn't hear what he was saying, but he was ushered out of the chambers. And I was thinking, well, couldn't you at least, like in some cases, I mean, even in your own interest, politely applause? Like, for example, and speaking of the Democrats, of course, when Trump said, for example, I've declared that there are just two genders, or yes, we said in my day two sexes, or maybe he said that I'm forbidding men from participating in women's sports. Um, these should be common sense things, and I think the great majority of Americans were glad to hear him say that, including, I'm sure, a lot of people who vote for the Democrats. But the Democrats couldn't even manage, one clap for that. But they did at one point clap. I actually missed this part, but I read about it later. The one time where they actually provided some applause is when Trump said that hundreds of billions of dollars had been sent to Ukraine. That's where they could manage to applause. And I say, well, this is what the Democrats have become. Um, it reminds me of actually his first term, where in the first couple of months, or let's just say the early part of his term, he was from the very start he was under attack, just relentless attack by the Democrats. Remember how intense it was, and the Russia hoax was part of it. It seems like this time they're on the back foot, but they were just attacking him constantly, and their friends in the media were attacking him constantly. And then he did one thing that made him stop and show respect. Like, they stood up and, basically saluted him as their president. Whereas before they wouldn't even recognize him as the president. They thought he was maybe this Manchurian candidate under the control of the Russians. That's when he launched an attack on Syria, which was, of course, on a pretext, on the false pretext that there had been a chemical weapons attack, and he killed some Syrians and whatever. And that's when the Democrats stood up and said, this man is our president. So this is the opposition. It's a sad thing. It's actually important to have a somewhat moral and intelligent opposition, to keep the other side honest. And we just don't have it in this country. And that's one reason why Trump was elected. I mean, this is the Democrat, the Democrats today. That's who they are.
Did he say anything else about Ukraine? You said he read some stuff after.
Yeah, let's see. One thing, he claimed that he had received a letter from Zelensky saying that Zelensky intended to negotiate now. Now, it was later admitted or discovered that he had received no such letter, that it was just some sort of tweet or social media post by Zelensky. And that was confirmed actually by the Ukrainians themselves. That that's all that was. He never sent him a letter. But I think you got there weren't any surprises. It's sort of a restatement of what he's said already. I'm going to bring this war to an end. I'm going to use the majesty, the power of my office to apply pressure to bring Zelensky and the Russians to the negotiating table. But I think he also said that we've improved relations with Russia, and clearly he has, and that is a real achievement.
So it seems, can you confirm whether or not that all arms shipments have stopped flowing to Ukraine? Because that's something you said.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, that was actually on Monday. We're saying I'd heard there were rumors that this was going to happen, that a decision was going to be made, I think the next day, the day after our last program. Or maybe it was later on the same day, I can't quite recall. But the decision was made, and it was made to halt shipments to Ukraine. And it wasn't actually declared officially, at least initially, by U.S. government officials. But it was confirmed, I think, very definitively by Donald Tusk, the president of Poland. He said that because that's where most of the arms actually are transshipped in Poland, and he said that it's just stopped. That the arms, the munitions that are in the warehouses are just staying in the warehouses. All deliveries, all movement is stopped on that front.
And I believe the CIA just confirmed that all intelligence sharing has also been stopped.
That's huge. Actually, that's, I think equally important. So because to a great extent, one of the reasons that Ukraine is still in the field is not just that they've been supplied with all these munitions over the past 3 years. Europe and the U.S. to a great extent have depleted their weapon stockpiles, right, for Ukraine in support of the Ukrainian war effort. But it's not only that; it's the sharing of intelligence, and that is something that they could not do on their own. They just don't have the capability. And by the way, the Europeans don't either. They don't have the satellites to monitor the battlefield. And that has, again, I think certainly the combination of the two has actually kept Ukraine. Ukraine's losing, but they're still there. They wouldn't be there if it wasn't for those two things from the United States.
Okay, so it seems like it had a big effect on Zelensky, right? Zelensky realizes that the jig is up and that he has to make a deal now. Or he seems to have made a U-turn.
It's not clear. Again, this is another character. Okay, Trump is kind of is boastful, childish. He's a showman, but yet, in spite of all that, he is accomplishing some, making some real changes. I think we have to admit that there's some real achievements to his name. Now, the other character is Zelensky. And Zelensky, it had been reported earlier, I think it was about 2 years ago, or maybe a year and a half ago in the New York Times, that his aides had said that this guy he doesn't really know what's going on. He's deluded, and there's just often no way to get through to him, to tell him the reality of what's happening. He lives in his own world. And then just the other day in Germany, the Der Spiegel magazine, which is a major German news publication, came out with an article. And again, remember, Germany, Der Spiegel in particular, has been a very, very enthusiastic supporter of the Ukrainian cause. They said, again, the reporter apparently interviewed aides to Zelensky, and they described him as a petulant child, meaning that he's very emotional, and when he gets, he just seems to fix on certain ideas, and he just cannot. There's just no way you can separate him from those. He has some idea in his head, and then he emotionally becomes attached to it, and he becomes very angry if you suggest, maybe this is not realistic, maybe we can't really do this, maybe we should reconsider. And it seems like he is not reconsidering, in spite of the world falling down behind him, around him. I mean, this should be a huge wake-up call, and maybe it will be. Maybe finally it will get through to him. But so far, he's shown himself incapable of really adjusting his course. He's still insisting on the same things. Occasionally, you'll get a statement that seems to suggest that he's softening his stance. I've seen that over the last year or two. But it's always, when you look at the details, it's like, okay, yeah, maybe I'll negotiate, or maybe I'll even resign. But that's if there's always a condition, NATO membership, for example, which is impossible. In other words, he's really not realistically proposing any kind of realistic, feasible change.
I guess my fear is that he might try to make a 180 and then come when he realizes that his situation is too desperate. But I just feel like you can't trust him anymore. If he says, okay, we sign this mineral deal, we'll do it, and then it'll just it'll drag the whole process out longer. All of a sudden, it's like we're not getting a clean break and end of this war because Zelensky's doing whatever he can to keep us involved. Do you think that's likely that could happen?
Yeah, I don't know if it's likely. I mean, again, it's just like it should be. Like, it seems like almost any other leader in the world would say, okay, yeah, I hate this guy. I don't want to do this, but I have to. This is reality. But he does not seem to be able to accept it. I mean, again, his behavior before the cameras in the White House last Friday, I think, demonstrated that to all of us. I think just about everybody, I think including there was a female ambassador of his, a diplomat anyway, in the audience who was observing him. I think there's famous pictures where she's just saying, "Oh my God, please stop talking." You could, it's so obvious her reaction. And I think would be the reaction of just about anybody, people that are pro or anti-Zelensky. It's just like, hey man, maybe you should stop right here. This isn't working. But he just kept on going. He just really seems to be very deaf to a lot of the, let's say, kind of the social or any kind of the realities that that a normal person is very much aware of. So I'm not sure that he will change. But I think you're right that actually it would be very smart for him to do that. Well, first of all, again, Boris Johnson advised him, right, to just sign the mineral deal. And then down the road, of course, it would be a win for Trump, but it's actually, the whole thing is sort of nonsense. Most of the mineral wealth, of course, is under Russian control, and there's really not that much to begin with, and so on and so forth. And it wouldn't even be possible for the U.S. to be involved in any sort of mining ventures while the war is going on. Even though Trump has said something to to contradict that, but I think that in fact it would be impossible. The thing is not realistic, but you just, okay, give Trump a win and then, let's just forget about it. The whole thing will just die away. And I think that's right. Uh, so that would have been wise for him to take that advice. He didn't take it. And another thing I think would be very, very clever of him, actually, it's nothing particularly brilliant, but if he actually did go out and offer, let's say, to say that he was willing to agree to a ceasefire. So far, he said no, or sometimes he'll say that, but there's always these impossible conditions. But if he went out and he just sort of said, okay, yeah, I'm willing to consider a ceasefire, let's see if we can do that. The Russians almost certainly would say no, because they've been saying no consistently to a ceasefire. And right now the focus is on Zelensky and Ukraine. They're not cooperating. They're the obstacle to peace. But he can make the Russians appear to be the obstacle to peace. He could go ahead and say, okay, yeah, I'm in favor of a ceasefire. The Russians would just keep on going. And then the Trump administration, the world would say, might think, well, geez, the Russians just don't want peace and the Ukrainians do. Again, I think the Russians have very good reasons for opposing a ceasefire. They've been burned in the past, and they have very, very good reasons. But that's maybe not how a lot of people would look at it. But he's not playing that kind of game. He's again the petulant child.
I'm wondering how dangerous Ukraine will be for Americans in the future. Because if you think about it, the Russians can't be, the ethnic Russian people in Ukraine can't be happy with America. I mean, we instigated this war, we've been fueling it and supporting it, and they've been devastated over the past 10 years. And then the western part of Ukraine, they're going to feel like you threw us into this, you got all of our people killed, and then you just abandoned us. Mm-hmm. And so I'm just thinking, even if we did do a mineral deal and we just come marching in and be like, all right, hey guys, you guys done fighting? We're going to just start taking your resources now.
Right.
It just seems like a dangerous situation, dangerous place. I mean, our fingerprints are all over this, and it's an absolute disaster on both sides. So, yeah, what do you think? Is it going to be pretty scary? I mean, are we going to see a lot of resentment, and can that manifest into other things?
Well, again, it's just that Ukraine is so weak that it's not going to present a military threat to the U.S. or certainly will be so weakened by that point. But we may have potentially a terrorist threat. Again, think of what happened in Afghanistan. We supported the Mujahideen then. I remember that. The Mujahideen were great heroes that were going to bring down the Soviet Union. And we armed them to the teeth. Osama bin Laden became involved in that, and we worked with him, and then we know how that ended. And there's a possibility that we'll see something similar. That we've been flooding Ukraine with arms. A lot of those arms are going to the front, but not all of them. I think everybody admits that a certain fraction, I don't know how large, has been diverted onto the black market, and then you have these ultranationalists within Ukraine that, of course, are willing to take U.S. arms, but really have no love for the U.S. or even for Western Europe. And then if in the end, it ends in disaster, as it almost certainly will for Ukraine, you have these angry people who are angry and violent people that are well armed. They can't really form an army that will be a threat to Europe as a whole, or to NATO or anything, but we could see terrorist attacks. I mean, there's so many weapons that have been dumped in there. So not just small arms, but we're talking about man pads, anti-aircraft missiles, things that could bring down an airliner, that kind of thing.
Yeah, it's scary. We, in a previous episode, we talked about just who's really at fault for this war. And you did a great job explaining just the history. And then ultimately you said, who's to blame for this? It's quite easy. It's the United States. And I'm wondering, when this is all said and done, will there be that recognition? Will this war be blamed on the United States? And if it is, I'm just thinking, how do we handle this? Do we accept responsibility and learn from it and have a rebirth. I think that's really the only place moving forward. But if we refuse to accept responsibility, do we end up dying in shame, basically, this country, instead of saying, like, this was wrong, we are changing direction. That America is dead. We have a new America, a new foreign policy,
Mm-hmm.
one that is not meddling in foreign affairs, not provoking wars around the world. We're here as a true peaceful nation.
Mm-hmm.
That's our mission. Do you think that's possible? How will this end?
Yeah, well, it's not. We have already seen some small steps in that direction. Again, the interview of Marco Rubio with Megyn Kelly. He did say things like that. For example, he said we need to start doing diplomacy again. Um, that is a recognition that we really had gone down the wrong path. It wasn't just the previous administration, but it was something I think clearly that flew out of that um, resulted from the unipolar moment. And Marco Rubio in that talk, very intelligently recognized that truth. And so, we are seeing some recognition. It's partial, it's imperfect. Again, with Trump, you get, um, you do you get both. Just like on the one hand, he says, well, yeah, we need to be friends with the Russians. This is a stupid war, this kind of thing, and then there's all this boasting about American power, and sometimes an implication that, yeah, we'll apply the screws. I haven't heard that so much recently, but we did hear that earlier. Maybe he's abandoned that kind of thinking. Um, but uh, but one thing you don't really see or hear rather from Trump is a recognition of the American role. He tends to put it on Zelensky and the Ukrainians. That's how he's been doing it. And it's just like, oh, they started the war. He actually did say that about Zelensky. Um, and but there is a denial of the American role. Not a complete denial. Okay, let's be honest. I mean, because again, Trump has at one point has said that, yeah, it was the expansion eastward was what provoked it, and that is kind of at least an indirect acceptance of American responsibility, because the Americans led that expansion. They even pushed the Europeans, like the Western Europeans, to accept it when they were more resistant. So we do see some movement in that direction, and there could be that recognition. It could be um, more, maybe a little bit more coherently set forth and comprehensively stated. But we are getting little bits and pieces, admissions here and there that, yeah, okay, we were responsible.
Do you think an admission of responsibility from the United States, at least to some extent, explaining our role in this conflict, is necessary to heal and end this conflict for good?
Well, I don't know if it's necessary, but I think it would be helpful. Not just for this conflict, but for potential future conflicts. I think there has to be a thorough rethinking, and I think again we are seeing the beginnings of that. But we've talked about the importance of changing the narrative, and we are starting to see that. Let's say at least holes have been punched in the narrative. There's a counter narrative that's starting to arise, and that it at least is gaining traction, at least like within Red America. But there's a ways to go before we really change the narrative fundamentally. But if we can do that, I think, yeah, the world will be just a safer place, and we'll all benefit. America above all, if we can give up the dream of global domination, we'll all be better off.
Right. I feel like it's important because if you don't do this and you just put all the blame on Ukraine,
Right.
it's unjust. It's not fair.
Yeah, no, it is.
And they know that, and that can lead to this lingering resentment, which could manifest into something awful in the future. I'm thinking it's not really comparable, but like in World War I, after the Treaty of Versailles, putting everything on Germany, wasn't fair, and
Right.
it ended up, destroying them completely economically, and then we know what happened. So, like, I don't know if it's in our nature though to be able to apologize for what we've done, but I think it's very important to do, but I
Uh-huh.
just this conflicts directly with Trump's character. He's not
Yeah.
exactly
Yeah.
a beacon of humility.
Right. Right.
So that's something that concerns me. I do feel
Yeah.
like it's
I mean,
important that.
it seems like he could frame it in a way that makes him look great and that would at least admit American guilt, at least partially. It wouldn't be a complete admission, but he could, emphasize that it was Biden who got us into this war. This was really stupid, and he said things like that, and it was Biden's fault. It was Boris Johnson's fault. Uh, that might be harder for him to do because I think Boris Johnson and Trump actually have friendly relations, but he could make that argument very forcefully. But I think like the mineral agreement would be a real sore point. Just imagine yourself. Yeah, I think it's important to put yourself in the shoes of a Ukrainian. We were led down this path. It's been an utter disaster, and we're led down it, in no small part by the U.S. and Great Britain. And here we are. Our country is in ruins. We've lost a huge chunk of territory. Um, and what is the U.S. doing for us? They're taking 50% of our resource wealth. If that's if in fact the mineral agreement does, if it is concluded and implemented, well, you can imagine the rage. It would be similar. You're right to what the Germans experienced, in the Weimar Republic in the years following the end of World War One, and that rage had the consequences that we well know. Who knows? I don't see Ukraine becoming a great power like Germany was, but who knows what the future, there could be potential alliances between the Western Ukraine and the Baltics. I know the Baltics by themselves don't imagine anything amount to much, but maybe Poland too. Who knows? In any case, it, it would be a festering sore that Ukraine would be, that would not only present a problem to Russia, which we've talked about earlier, but I think you're right. It would present a problem to all the West. Maybe it would just be support for terrorism, but it could develop into something more. Who knows? History, is full of surprises.
Right. It is a fear I have that if you leave that long festering wound of that injustice, it can manifest into something real nasty in the future. So I hope you're right. Trump has the opportunity to package it into his golden age deal. Like this is the new age.
Right.
That old era is over. That was Biden's era. That was the neocon era. Now we're
Right.
entering in the era where we don't do this type of thing. We
Yeah.
don't.
But right. Well, remember, it's like what really you can say just wedded Western Europe to the U.S. Was U.S. support for Western Europe after the end of World War II, the Marshall Plan, those kind of things. But he's got the opposite of a Marshall Plan right now for Ukraine. It's kind of an anti-Marshall Plan. We're not giving you anything; we're taking from you. But he really, I think, actually, the U.S. has a moral responsibility to do this, and all of Europe that has supported Ukraine in this war effort. They say, okay, look, let's admit defeat, and we admit our own responsibility in bringing this about, and it really is our job to reconstruct or help to reconstruct Western Ukraine. And of course, Russia will be working on, and it already is, making great progress in reconstructing what was Eastern Ukraine.
Do you think that will ever happen?
Probably not. You just don't see any signs of it. It's just, um, well, there has been some talk of that in Europe. You don't hear a lot of it. Right now, you're hearing talk about, creating some sort of great EU military. But I think that's all hot air.
Yeah, we really chewed up and spat out Ukraine, and then we're going to leave them to hang out and dry. And I just,
Yeah, a lot of angry people with a lot of weapons, and a lot of angry,
right,
violent people with lots of weapons, and who have scores to settle. That's
right,
a dangerous
right.
situation. You're right.
Right. Yeah, I think it's something that people haven't really thought about. I am a bit worried about the future if we don't accept our responsibility in this, and when this is all said and done, just think how you would feel if you lost your brother in the war. It's like this is, and you put the blame on America. You lose family members. Your son died, or your father, or something like this. It's not. It's awful. So I don't want to. I think people need to kind of remember just how horrible war is. We just
Yeah,
look at it on
yeah.
numbers and
No,
we
it's
start
easy.
cheering for one team or
Right.
the other. It's awful for everybody,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
it's a lot of it's our fault.
Right.
Yeah, we use this term collective West. Do you think that where we are now, that's no longer a term we can use?
Yeah, maybe it's time to toss that term aside. I was never a really big fan of it, but you could see it because again, the West spoke and acted as a single entity until pretty recently, and of course, Trump has maybe certainly he's changed it for the time being, but he may have done enough damage through his two, especially the second term, that it's just never going to be put back together again. One thing is he's created a kind of a permanent uncertainty. It's just that there used to be this belief that no matter what, the U.S. was there and always was going to be leading the so-called rules-based international order. That was just a fundamental truth. Similar to the Soviet Union was always going to be there, and it seems to be falling apart right now. And the thing is, you can't really undo this fact. Maybe you'll have another administration that'll a Democratic administration that'll come back in power in the U.S. and will reverse a lot of these policies and try to reestablish the so-called collective West. But there will be doubt in everybody's mind. It's just like it is no longer that certainty, that kind of undeniable fact. It used to have a reliable the certainty of a mountain. That mountain's always going to be there, right? It just now that it just might not. It was gone. It's going to come back. Who knows? Okay, the Democrats are here for 4 years, but maybe J.D. Vance will come back at the end of that and will abolish it. That just changes the whole dynamic.
Right. Yeah, we use the term collective West, also international rules-based order. Are those terms now antiquated, or should we be using new terms?
Yeah,
What's
well,
the world we live in
yeah,
when,
that's true. I mean, it's just like you could use it just certainly 6 weeks ago or even 4 weeks ago, and right now it's uh, I, you know you don't hear it. I mean, it seems like the last time I heard it was when the organizer of the Munich Security Conference he broke down in tears. He actually, when he was breaking down in tears, it's like he was crying about the loss, the collapse of the international, the rules based international order. That's what he was saying when he was crying. And so he saw the death of it right there.
so that's where we can pinpoint it. That guy crying, that's when it ended.
Yeah,
That's when
yeah,
it ended.
yeah,
So what do we say we have now? What if it's not? This was my whole life. That's what
yeah,
we had. This was the collective West rules based international order, and now it seems like that's not what we have anymore. Is it? Do we
yeah.
just say a multipolar world?
Well,
It's not just we're in this transition phase,
yeah,
right?
we're
That
in
it's like
between. I think we're just inevitably going to end up in a multipolar world. That's just the reality, and that was the trend. And it's just been that trend has just been accelerated by these statements and decisions by Trump and his administration. We're not out of it yet. We're not there yet, I should say. But we seem to be moving in that direction faster than I ever had anticipated.
okay. What happens? Do you think to the European Union? Is it going to stick together?
Um, yeah, for the foreseeable future. I mean, it looks like um, that I think like you could call them the Eurocrats, right? The European Commission. Um, that they are rubbing their hands with glee. They realize that this crisis is actually could be very much in their favor, at least in the short run. It's who was it said who said I think it was Obama's like chief of staff that you never let a good crisis go to waste. Meaning that when a crisis happens, that's the chance when you can actually implement these policies that in normal times would be impossible because they're not popular. But this is a chance to grab more power. You can say, we're under tremendous threat this time. We have to come together. So we must. The countries must cede more power to the central EU government in Brussels. And there is clearly an effort to do that, but they may be so incompetent that they don't succeed in doing it. But if nothing else, they have been accumulating power there in Brussels over the years. And I think it's likely to continue. Now, the whole thing may eventually come down because so many of their policies, especially their energy policies, are just so, well, energy and foreign policies, just beyond stupid. And it's just through their own incompetence, they may bring about their own collapse.
Right. I mean, if they consolidate power, it seems like Brussels' goal now is to resist Trump's America and Putin.
Right.
That's not going to work out. And China. That's not going to work out for them, right?
No.
Well, who are they? What's the... I know I always ask this. What's their plan? I don't know.
Yeah. Well, I'll say again that they just don't. They apparently don't have a plan. Other than just repeating the failed plan that they started with. Ukraine, victory for Ukraine, collapse in Russia. I think just recently, Keir Starmer and others have said, well, what we need to do is another sanctions package and more arms to Ukraine. That's what they've been doing for the past 3 years. And it's just beyond belief that they think that this is going to they kind of keep on pressing that or banging on that button again and again and again. And they're just incapable of stopping and saying, wait a second, maybe this isn't working. Clearly isn't. But there's always this thought that at some point it'll all turn around and it'll work. You aren't really hearing anything else from European leadership, again, with the exception of Slovakia and Hungary.
I don't know if this is true, I just saw on X right before we started, somebody posting that Hungary has been banned from voting in the EU Parliament or something like that. Is that true?
No, not yet. It's just the largest party in the EU Parliament, the European Parliament, is proposed banning them, stripping them of their voting rights. I don't know how they would do this, but that proposal has been made. Hungary has been under constant threat, and again, you have to admit, Viktor Orban has been very brave and really very successful, but he is up against the EU behemoth, and he leads a small country. And again, the EU does have a lot of levers that they can apply. They have, so it has been a tough fight, and it's going to continue to be a tough fight for Hungary. I don't know if they'll succeed in this particular plan of stripping them of the powers in the European Parliament, voting powers, but there's constantly, they're constantly working to undermine him.
Well, why doesn't Hungary just leave the EU?
Well, they do get benefits from it. That's the problem, is that it's sort of like, it's like the federal government in the U.S. The federal government has grown, to way beyond it has grown continually over the last several decades, or even over a century, and it's become something much larger than the founding fathers or even politicians of a few decades ago could have ever imagined. And with that growth, what it means is that so much of the states within the United States are really dependent on federal government money. So that really constrains them. So it makes it very hard for them to pursue an independent course. They kind of made a deal with the devil, you could say. It depends on what side you are on these different issues. But it's the same thing with Hungary. They do get a lot of benefits from being within the EU. Now, some of those I know have been, at least, from time to time, have been rescinded by the EU to punish him. but I think there still are benefits, and there are, um, um, advantages in terms of trade and so forth. So he's very reluctant to do that. But if the EU does push it too far, I think that would be a wise decision. And then you say, okay, just forget it. And then there's a whole other world out there. That's what Russia showed. It's that okay, if you can survive without the EU, you can survive without the West. This is a different world. It's not the world that existed a generation or two ago, where the world economy was completely dominated by the U.S. and Europe. So the G7 really was, the kind of the ruling nations, or the most economically prosperous nations in the world, and what they thought was what really mattered. It's just not true anymore. Again, China has risen and has become the greatest economic power. India is rising, and Russia is rising. It's just it goes beyond that. It's just that as we pointed out earlier, the BRICS economies now combined dwarfs those of the G7, and maybe at some point Hungary and other countries like Serbia, they're or Slovakia will just turn east and south, and they probably could do very well for themselves. So if they do it and they succeed, then that's a real problem for Europe, because again, I think that a lot of these countries are not happy with Brussels, but they do fear leaving them. They fear the economic consequences. But if a Hungary could or a Slovakia could chart an independent course and succeed without the EU, I think that would mean an awful lot. That would probably accelerate the process of disintegration. Brexit is a little bit different because it really hasn't, be honest, it really hasn't been very successful. I think the problem in the UK is that the government itself was not really in favor of it. They wanted to remain a part of the EU. So the establishment really didn't. They had to accept the vote against the EU, but they didn't really implement. They didn't actually listen to the voters and address their concerns, because the main concern, as I understand it, in the case of Great Britain, was unrestricted immigration, and that really hasn't changed. It's just like, okay, well, we have to break apart from the EU, but the establishment is still there, who still had all these the same ideas that had been rejected by the voters. But anyway, that's kind of an aside. But I could see Hungary, like under Orban, it would be something different, because there the establishment is truly independent and sovereign, and they could chart an independent course.
It'd be interesting to see, if they strip them of their voting rights in the European Parliament. I mean, it's like, come on, what are you doing here? What is this democracy we're speaking of now?
Right.
It's
I
a
think
joke.
it would be wise, because it's just that you constantly have this, the threats of, you are giving Brussels all these various levers that they can push, and you're constantly under threat from them, and you're constantly having to modify your behavior, it is a loss of sovereignty. You are accepting a certain amount of a certain loss of sovereignty by becoming a member of the EU. And they've managed to be much more independent than most countries, but still their independence is limited and is constantly under threat. But if they actually reached out to the rest of the world, see, this is the advantage of multipolarity, is that you don't have to make yourself dependent on any one pole, to put it that way. You foster good relations with China, with Russia, with India, Iran, and the global South, Brazil, and that gives you, that means that you are, again, you're not dependent on any one power. If there's one power that gives you problems, you can just kind of shift towards the others. And the thing is, like, each one of those great powers understands that, so they have an incentive to treat you decently. if they try to exercise the kind of control that like Brussels did over you, let's say if Moscow tried that, I don't think they would, and they haven't shown that tendency at all. But let's say they did, but you have options. You can, there are a lot of poles in the multipolar world, and so that even if Russia had that intention, and I don't believe they do, um, that they would be constrained by that fact. They would understand that they could not do like what Brussels is doing now, because this country has options. The thing is, when you sign up for the EU project, your options are severely limited.
Okay, interesting. We'll see how it plays out. Do you think that there's a chance that NATO will fall apart?
Well, I think you have to say there is a chance now. I mean, it's obviously under some severe strains. Um, the because the U.S. Or NATO rather was dominated by the U.S. It was entirely, and Trump has never liked NATO, and I think he's right about that. It should have ended when the Cold War ended. Um, I don't think he's going to attempt to destroy it, directly, just simply withdraw. That seems to me unlikely. But the 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 course that he's charting now is going to greatly weaken NATO. Um, let's say just the one thing that he said consistently, and a lot of people back him up on this, not just Trump supporters, who say, hey, the Europeans should pay their fair share because really the U.S. has been allowing the Europeans a free ride, in terms of military expenditures. So their expenditures have been very minimal, and they've instead chosen to put their money into things like social welfare and so forth. That's the one reason that Europe is able to have the lifestyle, the social systems that Europe has now. Um, so Trump has been insisting on 5%. Maybe that's high. I don't know what I think the U.S. percentage is not quite that high, but it's been very low. Previously, it was 2%, and most countries never even met that. Um, but let's say if he succeeds in that, and then the Europeans actually do up their percentages to something close to 5%, and if they really believe in this Russian threat, it seems amazing to me they haven't done this already. Again, it's just like they're all about rhetoric and the narrative. They just kind of think if we keep on repeating things, but you just don't see very much in the way of any kind of real sacrifice, let's say, on the part of Europeans. But if they do, well, that actually makes the Europeans less dependent on the U.S. right now because they had this free ride, kind of like Hungary vis-a-vis the EU, European NATO vis-a-vis the U.S., was dependent on them. So they were subject to U.S. pressures in a way. They really had to listen to the boss back in Washington. But if they do, in fact, put up more of a substantial amount of their own money, they will be much less dependent on the U.S. and they may start to chart an independent course, which could mean the end of NATO.
Well, when they put up more money, isn't it just a grift basically to buy American munitions and equipment that's
Well,
overpriced?
that's the problem. Yeah, well, that's the problem is that they don't really have a military industrial complex to speak of. The only country that did to any extent was Germany, but it's shown itself to be really incapable of meeting the needs of of the war that we're seeing in Ukraine. Much less an all-out Russian NATO war, which God forbid, will never happen. I don't want that to ever happen, but.
So yeah, just saying they bump it up to 5% just means that they're just going to be giving that money to America for overpriced goods, right? It doesn't help them chart an independent course.
Yeah,
and that's what it does is they get pissed off. They're like, we're paying way too much, not getting enough bang for our buck, and then they say, you know what, we're going to break out of NATO and we can enter the open market, and then we can buy weapons from Russia, from China. It'll be competitive, and then the MIC in the United States would just collapse because.
Right. Well, of course, if you're really talking about defense, you do want to develop your own native industries so that you're not dependent on any other country that could be a potential adversary or, at least an ally of or an ally of a potential adversary. And they're their MIC is woefully inadequate at this point, and it takes a long time to build up something like that. I think that's we're talking about a decade or decades.
Yeah, I imagine
Yeah, so
decades.
just spending money, you're right. If you don't have the capacity, just spending a lot of money just raises the price of the limited items that you have. So let's say if there becomes a bidding war, there's more dollars or rather here euros out there in chasing a limited number of munitions. Well, what happens if the supply doesn't go up? This is basic economics. The prices just go up. That's what happens. So you spend more money, but in the end, you don't really get anything more for it. You need to do more than that. You need to actually build up, this entire uh, ecology of industries and of general industry and also military, civilian industry and military industry, which will to a great extent depend on civilian industry. But much of Europe, is deindustrialized. Like the one exception was Germany, but we see them going down the path of deindustrialization now. So this is, we're talking about a huge, huge challenge for them, and it's not going to be fixed by some decision made in Brussels. Uh, there's going to have to be a huge commitment on the part of all the countries. And I don't know how they're going to coordinate, because they would have to coordinate. You can't just have the Latvians doing one thing and the Poles doing another or whatever it is. You'd end up with a mess. There's no interoperability, and these countries in themselves have limited resources. It would have to be, if you're going to compete with a power like Russia or the U.S. for that matter, or China, it would have to be a Europe-wide effort. And they Brussels really hasn't shown the ability to do anything like that. There's recently von der Leyen declared that that the EC, the European Commission, had a plan to make 800 billion euros available to EU countries for just for building up military industries. But what that meant was that it would just be available in the form of loans. And, most of these countries are already have a great deal of debt. It didn't really sound like a plan at all. I mean, I don't see how that's going to make any difference.
Do you think that's a path that Europe should even chart? Try to build up its own European military industrial complex? I mean, are they really at risk? I mean, Russia,
Yeah.
America's not going to invade them. Russia, I know they
Yeah.
maybe, I don't think they really think it, but Russia's not going
Yeah.
to invade them either.
Right.
So, well,
Yeah.
what if you were in charge? I mean, it just seems like, okay, everybody, we got to buckle down and we got to start become a military power of our own. Where are we starting from? We're starting from pretty much zero. We got
Yeah.
nothing. We have
Right.
huge amounts of debt. We got to, who knows if the EU is going to even survive in the next 10, 20 years.
Right.
So I mean, you don't have cohesion. It just seems like, I don't know if it's a venture that they should do, or do you think it's necessary that Europe does become a strong military power to establish itself as a big pole in this multipolar world?
Yeah. Well, it's a difficult question. I mean, there were certain advantages to NATO back in the day. I mean, it was a British lord, I can't remember his name, who said that the purpose of NATO was to keep the Russians out, well, the Americans in, the Russians out, and the Germans down. Um, and you could rephrase it and say that an important part of it was not just the potential enemy, which was the Soviet Union in that day, but also the it imposed a certain at least military unity on Europe, which worked very well for decades, especially when America was so prosperous, and it allowed again the European nations to devote their money not to militaries, but to not to military spending, but to social spending, and to the and it contributed greatly to the prosperity of Europe. Um, One of the dangers, let's say, if NATO really ends and you don't have, let's say, a single, a unified bloc that is actually, again, dominated by the US, is that you don't have a power to, again, to keep the Germans down. And then there is a potential if they say, okay, if there really is a move towards an increase in military spending, just on the NATO's gone on the part of separate European powers, then we kind of we find ourselves returning to the old Europe, which was often um, war torn. There was a it's been a there's a potential anyway. There's a fear, maybe it's not justified. I don't think it's justified at all in the short run, but in the long run, it probably is. It's just that a fear that we could see war within Europe. I mean, between the different NATO powers, if NATO in fact leaves. Again, I don't see that at all now. So there is something to be said for this larger structure, just to, maybe to have, if not NATO, some replacement for it, just to kind of to keep all the countries on board and unified and not looking at, eh, looking at each other as a potential threat, not having an arms race within Europe. But it's messy. It's hard to do. The challenge is for Europe is that okay, yeah, there is a danger in having these independent countries, but the independent countries are real. The French are French, the Germans are Germans, and the Germans are willing to do something to, sacrifice for their own people, and vice versa for and the same is true for the French. I don't think anybody really, you say, well, the alternative is we can have a central power in Brussels, but what you find is that nobody really wants to sacrifice for Brussels. It's this kind of gray bureaucratic entity that nobody is going to ever be enthusiastic about. Maybe you can make these arguments for it, but it's just it's sort of like maybe the Chinese are proud of China, the Russians are proud of Russia, but I don't know that the Europeans are proud of the EU. It's not the same thing. So they're in kind of a fix. I don't know what the solution is.
Right. Well, I mean, you're saying that there's a risk of potentially a future conflict if they build up their own individual militaries, and that's true if we look at history. But NATO has got us into our current conflict now, so it's
right.
just like
Yeah,
having a centralized government.
Yeah,
And especially if it's built around hating Russia, that just could potentially lead to another conflict.
Yeah, no, that's very true. I mean, it's just like what I was saying. The argument for a larger European authority is the same thing. You can say it's sort of like a miniature version or regional version, or maybe we can talk about a single continent, Europe, as opposed to the globalist vision. Because the globalist vision actually is, it's undergirded by the same kind of thinking. It's like, we need to have like this one world, right? And if we can impose this one vision and upon the whole world, really impose it. I mean, that there really would be a rules-based international order, which is, of course, centered really in Washington and then secondarily in Brussels. We can bring an end to war. That's the idea, because everybody would be under essentially this one world government, or at least would have to bow to this one power, and that way peace can be maintained. That's how often what believers in this global hegemony will say. Their fear is that if this global hegemonic vision ends and the U.S. and Europe retreat from much of the world, well, then there will be this power vacuum, and then wars will erupt, because in their mind they were keeping the peace. Now, of course, the problem with that, as you pointed out, is that over the last couple of decades, or last few decades, most of the world's major wars in the world are were actually caused by the same vision. It was this insistence on maintaining global hegemony and not respecting the sovereignty of different countries. So Yeah, you do make a good point. The same thing, I think you can make the same argument for a central European authority versus having independent states. You can never eliminate the danger of war. Um, but I think again, right, if um, yeah, the multipolar world is not any guarantee of peace, but it's I think the only way we can go. I mean, it's just in the end, it's actually better for those smaller countries, again, because it gives them options in a way that they don't have now.
Okay. All right, Dad. Well, I think we can end it there. Unless there's anything else you want to say.
No, I think I said enough for today.
Okay, sounds good. All right. Well, have a good rest of your day then.
Okay, you too.
Okay. Bye bye.
Bye.